Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. Tonight I'd like to cordially invite you to attend a little tea party with some of my nearest and dearest friends. And no tea party at the Poe Museum would be complete without Edgar Allan Poe's Teapot. And that will be the subject of tonight's installment of the Curator's Crypt. So this is it. Edgar Allan Poe's tea set. And you're probably thinking, this is some pretty nice stuff. Poe was dirt poor for most of his career. He was just barely struggling to make ends meet from his writings. How could he afford something like this? Well, he inherited it from his foster mother, Frances Allan. And as you know, Poe's foster father never really much cared for him, didn't want to take in this orphan actress's kid. But a month before Poe's third birthday, this little orphan Edgar got taken in by Frances Allan. She was childless. She really wanted somebody to take care of, so she offered little Edgar a home. She kind of had to talk her husband into it, but she remained devoted to Poe for the rest of her life. And Edgar just adored her. Unfortunately, after college, after his 1 year at college, he was fighting with Allan so much that he stormed out of the house. He ran away from home. He told them he'd gone to St. Petersburg, Russia. Actually, he'd enlisted in the U.S. Army, and he ended up not far from Richmond over at Fort Monroe. And while he was in the Army, Poe's foster parents celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary. This was February 5th, 1828. And what's the 25th anniversary? The silver anniversary. So this would have been an appropriate gift. Someone gave this to them in honor of their silver anniversary. And when we look at it, it fits with the time period. You look on the bottom and there's the hallmark there for R&W Wilson of Philadelphia. They were active from 1825 to about 1846. So that fits right into our time period if these are going to be from 1828. And another thing you notice, each of these pieces has an arm and the hand is clasping a dagger. And underneath it is the Latin inscription, Et derigat Deus, and God guides. So God guides the dagger. That was the Allan family crest. So these fit pretty well into the Allans. But back to our story, Poe was away at Fort Monroe, and he heard that Frances Allan was dying. She probably had something long-term like tuberculosis or asthma, but she was wasting away. She knew she was in her final days. Her last wish was to see her little Eddie one final time. But he couldn't get here from Fort Monroe in time, and he missed saying goodbye to her. He even missed her funeral by 1 day. But to remind him that she still cared about him, and she still loved him, she left him this tea set. She left him some other things, like a little silver spoon, which I've mentioned a few other times before, that's not in the Poe Museum collection. But at least you can see these things that she left behind as this reminder for him. And shortly thereafter, Poe was able to find a substitute to take his place and serve out the rest of his enlistment over at Fort Monroe, so he'd go to the United States Military Academy at West Point. So Poe likely could have taken these with him when he went to West Point. And after he was expelled from there, he went to New York City briefly, then went to Baltimore. And Baltimore, where we know he lived in the Poe House. All of his houses were Poe houses, but this was the Poe House that's now the Poe House and Museum of Baltimore, where he lived with his grandmother, Elizabeth Poe, her daughter, his aunt, Maria Clem, who was widow, her daughter, Virginia, and then Virginia's brother, Henry, who just sort of died early. We don't know exactly what happened to him. So that's the established provenance of how these things got to Poe. And sure, a lot of his guests recall that Poe enjoyed drinking tea and coffee, and he wrote in a letter from April of 1844 to Maria Clem about how he was staying in a nice boarding house in New York, and they had the nicest tea you ever drank, strong and hot. So apparently he liked strong, hot tea, and it might have just fueled his creativity. According to an 1899 article by someone who claimed to have known him, a cup of tea or coffee excited that abnormal condition of mind in which he lived to exaltation. Another account says that after Poe walked the 15 miles from New York City up to his cottage in Fordham, he drank a cup of tea, and it energized him to spend the whole night writing, and he produced The Raven in one sitting. I don't think that's very reliable based on a number of reasons, mostly that he'd already written The Raven before he moved to Fordham. But another account says that Poe stopped by somebody's house in New York, had some of their coffee, and it kept him up all night in a frenzy of writing. So apparently, just like a lot of today's writers, Poe depended on his caffeine to really keep him up and keep him focused. But many of his friends recall having tea with him, including Marie Louise Shue and John Sartain. And he even mentions tea in some of his works. I think my favorite example would have to be in The System of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather, where they describe a man who thinks he's a giant teapot and he polishes himself every morning. And they say that, oh yeah, there's a guy who thinks he's a teapot in pretty much every hospital in France back then. And so that's Poe humor for you. So Poe liked his tea, and he might just have poured his tea from these teapots. There's one here, one here. This is for your creamer, or today your oat milk, and you'd keep your sugar in here. And each of these pieces has the little Allan family crest on it. So it looks like Poe eventually had to part with his beloved foster mother's tea set. It looks like he either sold or pawned it, and it came into the possession of a Baltimore writer and lawyer and acquaintance of Poe's, David Gilmore Hoffman. And he passed it down to his son, Latimer Hoffman. But eventually came back to the Poe family when Poe's cousin Nelson Poe's grandson, Philip Livingston Poe, bought it. And Philip Livingston Poe was not only Poe's cousin's grandson, he was also Poe's wife Virginia's half-sister / cousin's grandson. So this was a very close family connection. These are people who knew Poe very well and knew his wife very well. And it was passed down through Philip Livingston Poe's family until it came up for auction, and the literary collector Susan Jaffe Taine bought it. And she now has it on loan to the Poe Museum, where you can see it right here in the Susan Jaffe Taine room. And hopefully it will serve as a reminder that rather than being dependent upon alcohol when he was writing, Poe is very likely fueled by caffeine. It's also a reminder that no matter how popular Poe got, no matter how well his work sold during his lifetime, he was still just barely scraping by. And even though this probably had a great deal of sentimental value for him, he had to part with these items just to keep food on the table. It's the same story you see elsewhere in here in the museum when you see his pocket watch, which he had to give to pay off a debt to his tailor. You see his penknife on display that he had to use to secure a loan that he was never able to pay back. So these are reminders of the opulence in which the Allans lived and how Poe was really shut off from that after Francis Allan died. John Allan completely left him out of the will. So this is Poe's inheritance from the Allan family. So that's going to leave our tea party on a bit of a downer. and you wouldn't expect anything less from the Poe Museum. But let us know down in the comments what you think. Which of Poe's stories or poems could have been inspired by caffeine binges? Or tea or coffee-fueled all-night writing sessions? Let us know down in the comments. And if you'd like to help us preserve precious Poe pieces, like Poe's teapots, or our collection of Poe dolls, why not contribute to the Poe Museum or become a member at poemuseum.org. And until next time, thanks for joining us, and I'll leave you with some more gratuitous footage of the Poe Museum cats doing Poe Museum cat stuff.